September the 7th, 1940. 21:43 hours, 18,000 feet above the Thames estuary. Hauptmann Werner Hoffman adjusted his headset, listening intently to the steady dot-dash-dot signal pulsing through his earphones. His Heinkel 111 bomber droned through the darkness, invisible in the moonless night, relying entirely on the electromagnetic pathway that would lead his formation to their target in London's East End. The Knickebein system, named for its bent leg appearance on technical diagrams, was Germany's secret weapon, a radio navigation technology that Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself had declared would make German bombers unstoppable even in total darkness. Hoffman had complete faith in the system. For weeks, German crews had been using these radio beams to find targets with uncanny accuracy, hitting factories, dockyards and railway yards that would have been impossible to locate visually at night. The British, German intelligence assured them, had no idea these beams existed and possessed no technology to counter them, even if they did discover them. What Hoffman didn't know, what none of the 348 German bombers crossing the English coast that night knew, was that 90 miles away in a nondescript building in Malvern, a team of British scientists led by a young physicist named Reginald Victor Jones had spent the past 4 months unravelling the secrets of German radio navigation. They had not only discovered the beams, but had developed countermeasures so sophisticated that German crews would never know their supposedly infallible guidance system had been compromised. The bombs that Hoffman believed would devastate London's docks were about to fall harmlessly in the Kent countryside, victims of the world's first systematic electronic warfare campaign. This is the story of the Battle of the Beams, a secret war fought not with bullets and bombs but with radio waves and mathematics, where British scientific ingenuity defeated German technological confidence, and where the fate of nations hung on the precise manipulation of electromagnetic frequencies. The origins of this electronic duel stretch back to June 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped from Dunkirk, and Hitler's Luftwaffe controlled the skies over Western Europe. The German Air Force had developed sophisticated radio navigation systems precisely because they understood what British Air Marshal Hugh Dowding knew all too well. Bombing accuracy at night was abysmal. Without visual reference, even experienced crews missed their targets by miles. Pre-war studies had shown that only 20% of bombs dropped at night fell within 5 miles of their intended targets. The Luftwaffe's solution was technological brilliance combined with German engineering precision. The Knickebein system represented a revolutionary approach to navigation. German engineers had mounted modified Lorenz landing beam transmitters, powerful radio stations normally used to guide aircraft onto runways at strategic locations in occupied Europe. These stations transmitted narrow radio beams across hundreds of miles. A bomber equipped with the proper receiver could fly along one beam until it intersected a second beam transmitted from a different station. The point where these beams crossed marked the target with mathematical precision. The system was elegant, reliable, and appeared undetectable. The radio frequencies used between 30 and 33 MHz were within normal aircraft communication bands. The beams themselves were so narrow, only about 500 yards wide at a distance of 200 miles, that German planners believed British detection would be impossible. But German confidence had not accounted for the peculiar genius of British scientific intelligence, specifically a 28-year-old physicist working in the Air Ministry's intelligence section. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, known as R.V. Jones to colleagues, possessed a mind uniquely suited to electronic detective work. Educated at Oxford under the great physicist Frederick Lindemann, Jones combined theoretical brilliance with practical engineering knowledge. More importantly, he understood that in modern warfare, the nation that controlled the electromagnetic spectrum could determine the outcome of battles. Jones first learned of German radio navigation on June 21, 1940, from a document recovered from a crashed German bomber. A Luftwaffe prisoner of war had mentioned during interrogation that his unit used a special navigation system called Knickebein. The prisoner, an airman named Lieutenant Wilhelm Schmidt from Kampfgeschwader 26, had been shot down during a raid on Birmingham. Initially, Schmidt refused to discuss the system, but skillful interrogation by squadron leader Dennis Felkin, who spoke flawless German, eventually extracted crucial details. Schmidt described a radio navigation system that allowed blind bombing with unprecedented accuracy, mentioning transmission frequencies in the characteristic equus signal zone where overlapping beams indicated the target position. The implications were staggering. If the Germans possessed such technology and Britain didn't, the Luftwaffe could bomb British cities and factories to rubble under the cover of darkness, while British defences flailed uselessly. Jones immediately began investigating, but he faced institutional scepticism that nearly proved fatal. Many senior RAF officers dismissed the idea as impossible. They argued that radio beams couldn't possibly be accurate over hundreds of miles, that atmospheric conditions would scatter any such signal, and that even if such beams existed, German bombers lacked the equipment to use them effectively. Jones found an ally in Professor Frederick Lindemann, Winston Churchill's scientific advisor and Jones's former mentor. On June 21, 1940, Lindemann arranged for Jones to brief Churchill directly on the Knickebein threat. The meeting took place at 10 Downing Street, after Churchill's usual evening conference with military chiefs. Jones, just 28 years old, faced the Prime Minister across a table covered with situation maps and intelligence reports. Churchill listened with intense concentration as Jones explained the principles of radio beam navigation, bringing technical diagrams showing how intersecting radio beams could pinpoint targets, frequency analysis suggesting where German transmitters might operate, and testimony from prisoners confirming the system's existence. Churchill immediately understood the threat and the opportunity. If German bombers could find targets in darkness with precision, Britain's industrial capacity could be destroyed. But more importantly, Churchill grasped something the skeptics had missed. The Knickebein system represented a vulnerability. Any radio system could potentially be jammed, spoofed, or manipulated. At the end of Jones's presentation, Churchill issued an order that would change the course of the electronic war. He directed that Britain's scientific and intelligence resources be mobilized immediately to confirm the existence of German radio beams and develop countermeasures. He established a special committee with authority to requisition equipment and personnel from any government department, and most crucially, he gave Jones direct access to report findings without bureaucratic interference. The first task was confirmation. Jones needed physical evidence that Knickebein beams existed and operated as described. On June 22, 1940, he contacted the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Worth-Matravers, requesting they search for suspicious radio transmissions in the 30 to 33 MHz band. Squadron leader Harold Shepard Lywood was initially skeptical, pointing out that searching for a narrow beam transmission was like looking for a needle in an electromagnetic haystack. But Lywood was thorough. On the night of June 22nd, he directed his operators to systematically scan the suspected frequencies. At 23:18 hours, an operator named Corporal Mackey detected something unusual, a steady modulated signal at 31.5 MHz, far stronger than any normal aircraft communication, exhibiting characteristics consistent with a navigation beam. The breakthrough came on June 23rd when a specially equipped RAF aircraft, an Avro Anson flown by Flight Lieutenant H.E. Bufton, took off from RAF Whiten to physically intercept and map a suspected beam. Bufton carried detection equipment hastily installed by the Telecommunications Research Establishment, a modified radio receiver tuned to 31.5 MHz, connected to a strip chart recorder that would document signal strength variations. At 145 hours on June 24th, flying at 10,000 feet over Lincolnshire, Bufton's receiver suddenly registered a dramatic signal increase. He had found the beam. Following Jones's instructions, Bufton flew a series of systematic patterns across and along the signal, mapping its width, direction, and modulation. The results confirmed everything Jones had theorized. The beam was approximately 500 yards wide, transmitted from the direction of a German-occupied territory, and exhibited the characteristic dot-dash modulation pattern Schmidt had described. The evidence was irrefutable. The German radio navigation system existed exactly as Jones had predicted. But confirmation of the threat was only the beginning. Jones now faced a more difficult challenge, developing countermeasures against a system the Germans believed was undetectable and unjammable. The solution required understanding not just the technology, but the psychology of the German crews who relied on it. Jones realized that crude jamming, simply broadcasting noise on the beam frequencies, would be ineffective and potentially counterproductive. German operators would recognize jamming, know their system had been compromised, and switch to backup navigation methods or alternative frequencies. The countermeasures needed to be subtle, sophisticated, and above all, undetectable to the German crews. The beams needed to be manipulated rather than destroyed, bent rather than broken. Jones's team at the Air Ministry developed a strategy they called meaconing and masking. The concept was diabolically clever. British transmitters would broadcast signals identical to the German navigation beams, but slightly offset in direction. German receivers would pick up both the genuine German beam and the British counterfeit. Because radio receivers couldn't distinguish between multiple signals on the same frequency, the aircraft's navigation equipment would respond to the combined signal, which would be displaced from the true beam direction by a predictable amount. Bombers, following what they believed was the correct beam, would actually be following a composite signal that led them systematically off target. The technical challenges were formidable. British countermeasure transmitters needed to precisely match German signal characteristics: frequency, modulation pattern, timing, and power level. Any mismatch would alert German operators that something was wrong. Moreover, the countermeasure signals needed to be powerful enough to influence aircraft receivers, but not so powerful that they swamped the genuine German signals entirely. The goal was subtle deviation, not obvious jamming. German crews needed to believe their navigation system was working perfectly while being led gradually off course. The responsibility for implementing this system fell to Squadron Leader Edward Addison of No. 80 Wing, a secret RAF unit established specifically for radio countermeasures. Addison's team included some of Britain's finest radio engineers, men who had worked in commercial broadcasting before the war and understood transmitter design intimately. They had 6 weeks to build, test, and deploy a network of countermeasure transmitters capable of covering all potential German beam approaches to British targets. Engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment designed transmitters that could replicate German Knickebein signals with sufficient precision to fool aircraft receivers. The transmitters, designated Type M for masking, used modified commercial broadcasting equipment combined with precision frequency control circuits. By mid-July 1940, the first countermeasure transmitters were operational. They were installed at carefully selected sites around Britain, positioned to intercept German beams approaching major cities and industrial areas. The locations were chosen through meticulous analysis of German beam geometry. Jones's team had mapped every known German transmitter location in occupied Europe and calculated the beam paths that would target critical British installations. British countermeasure transmitters were then positioned to optimally interfere with these beam paths. Each installation was carefully camouflaged and guarded, with cover stories prepared in case German intelligence discovered them. The system required extraordinary operational coordination. Each night, as German bombers prepared to take off from their bases in France, Belgium, and Norway, British intelligence tracked their preparations through multiple sources. The Y Service, Britain's signals intelligence organisation, monitored German communications for indications of target selection and timing. Observers along the coast reported aircraft formations crossing the channel. All this intelligence flowed to Fighter Command Headquarters and simultaneously to No. 80 Wing, where Addison's team activated the appropriate countermeasure transmitters. The first operational test came on August 13, 1940, during a major Luftwaffe raid targeting the Short Brothers aircraft factory in Rochester. German bombers approached using Knickebein guidance, confident in their ability to hit the factory despite darkness. British countermeasure operators activated their transmitters, broadcasting false signals that gradually bent the German beam several degrees off its true course. The result was devastatingly effective. Bombs intended for the aircraft factory fell instead in open countryside 3 miles from the target. The factory, working at full capacity building Sterling bombers, was undamaged. German crews returned to their bases reporting successful navigation and bombing, unaware they had missed entirely. But the Germans were not fools, and their radio navigation technology continued evolving. By September 1940, Luftwaffe signals units had deployed an even more sophisticated system called X-Gerät, meaning X device. This system represented a quantum leap in precision. Unlike Knickebein, which relied on crews judging the moment when intersecting beams crossed, X-Gerät used an automated bombing computer that calculated the precise bomb release point based on a series of radio signals. The system employed 4 beams, 3 precisely spaced crossbeams that activated timing mechanisms in the aircraft, and 1 main approach beam along which the bomber flew. As the aircraft crossed each beam, the bombing computer measured time intervals and calculated ground speed. When the bomber reached the calculated release point, indicated by crossing the final beam, the computer automatically released the bombs. British intelligence first learned of X-Gerät in late August 1940 through a combination of signals intercepts and prisoner interrogations. A Luftwaffe signalman captured after bailing out over Kent mentioned during interrogation that new equipment had been installed in selected bomber units. The prisoner, an Unteroffizier named Heinrich Müller from Kampfgruppe 100, described a system far more sophisticated than Knickebein, involving multiple beams and automatic bomb release. Jones immediately recognized X-Gerät as a critical threat. The automated nature of the system meant it would be far more accurate than Knickebein, potentially achieving bombing precision measured in yards rather than miles. Moreover, the pathfinder role of Kampfgruppe 100, the elite unit equipped with X-Gerät, meant these aircraft would drop incendiaries to mark targets for following bomber waves. The challenge with X-Gerät was its sophistication. The system operated at different frequencies than Knickebein, around 66 to 75 MHz, and employed more complex modulation. Dr. Robert Cockburn, a radio engineer working with Jones, proposed an ingenious solution. Rather than transmitting false beams continuously, British countermeasure transmitters would wait until a German bomber crossed the first crossbeam, then transmit full signals representing the subsequent crossbeams at carefully calculated incorrect intervals. The German bombing computer, receiving these false signals, would miscalculate the aircraft's ground speed and position, commanding bomb release at the wrong moment. The bombs would fall short or long of the target by distances proportional to the timing error introduced by the false signals. The effectiveness of British countermeasures became clear on the night of November 14, 1940, during the raid that would become infamous as the Coventry Blitz. This operation was intended to destroy Coventry's aircraft and munitions factories. Kampfgruppe 100, equipped with X-Gerät, would mark the target with incendiaries, followed by waves of conventional bombers. British intelligence knew the raid was coming through ultra-intercepts from Bletchley Park. Churchill faced an agonising decision: activate countermeasures and potentially reveal that Britain had broken German codes, or allow Coventry to be bombed. Churchill chose to allow some bombs to fall to protect the ultra-secret, but authorised full activation of countermeasures against X-Gerät pathfinders to minimise damage. No. 80 Wing activated every available countermeasure transmitter as Kampfgruppe 100's Heinkel 111S approached. British operators transmitted false crossbeam signals, attempting to fool the German bombing computers into releasing incendiaries too early. The results were mixed due to the unprecedented scale of the attack. Some of Kampfgruppe 100's incendiaries fell outside Coventry's centre, victims of successful beam bending, but others fell accurately, creating fires that guided the following bomber waves. The raid ultimately destroyed much of Coventry's medieval city centre and killed 568 people. But the aircraft factories, the primary targets, suffered relatively light damage. Many bombs intended for the factories fell in residential areas or open fields, diverted by British electronic warfare. The Coventry raid demonstrated both the power and limitations of electronic countermeasures. German crews returned believing their navigation systems had performed flawlessly. Luftwaffe intelligence analysts noted discrepancies between intended target areas and actual bomb impacts, but attributed this to bombing altitude errors rather than navigation system compromise. The critical point was that German confidence in their radio navigation remained intact. British countermeasures were working precisely as designed. They were degrading bombing accuracy without alerting the Germans that their beams were being manipulated. By early 1941, the Luftwaffe deployed Y-Gerät, an even more complex system. Y-Gerät employed a single beam along which the bomber flew, but instead of relying on multiple crossbeams, the system used radar ranging to measure the aircraft's distance from the transmitter with extraordinary precision. The ground station transmitted a pulse signal that the aircraft's equipment received and retransmitted. By measuring the round-trip time of these pulses, the ground station could determine the aircraft's position along the beam to within a few yards. At the proper moment, the ground station transmitted a release signal that activated the bomber's automatic bomb release. Jones learned of Y-Gerät through signals intelligence intercepts in January 1941. He immediately recognized the threat. Y-Gerät combined the precision of X-Gerät with the flexibility of continuous ground control. The countermeasure challenge was formidable. Jones and Wing Commander Raymond Hart proposed a system called Domino that would exploit Y-Gerät's two-way communication architecture. British transmitters would receive the German ground station's ranging pulses and retransmit them at slightly altered timings, creating false position information. The German ground station, receiving both the genuine aircraft response and the British false signals, would calculate incorrect aircraft positions and transmit bomb release commands at the wrong moment. The first operational use of Y-Gerät by the Luftwaffe came in March 1941. Kampfgruppe 26 flew its first Y-Gerät guided mission on March 19th, targeting Portsmouth Dockyard. British countermeasure operators activated Domino transmitters, feeding false ranging data into the German control system. The results exceeded expectations. German bombers released their bombs at what their ground controllers indicated was the correct release point, but the weapons fell 2 miles from Portsmouth Dockyard, impacting mostly in open countryside and water. What made this success particularly significant was the German reaction, or rather, lack of reaction. Kampfgruppe 26's crews reported successful bombing based on their instrument readings. Luftwaffe analysts attributed the miss to altitude measurement errors, never suspecting British transmitters had systematically fooled their supposedly unjammable system. Throughout spring and summer 1941, the Battle of the Beams continued with increasing sophistication on both sides. By mid-1941, No. 80 Wing operated over 50 countermeasure transmitter sites across Britain, staffed by more than 2,000 personnel. The effectiveness was measurable. Statistical analysis showed that German raids using radio navigation were systematically less accurate than expected from the system's theoretical performance. Bombs fell on average 1 to 3 miles from intended targets when British countermeasures were active. British factories, ports and cities that should have been devastated survived with damage that, while terrible, was far less than Luftwaffe planning had anticipated. The turning point came in late 1941 as Germany's strategic priorities shifted eastward. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, drew Luftwaffe resources away from the strategic bombing campaign against Britain. Bomber units needed for night attacks on British cities were redeployed to support ground operations in Russia. While this shift was primarily due to strategic reorientation, British electronic warfare had contributed significantly. The Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign had failed to achieve its objectives despite Germany's technological sophistication. British cities and factories survived, and Britain remained in the war. The full story of the Battle of the Beams remained classified long after the war ended. German officers captured in 1945 were stunned to learn that British electronic warfare had been systematically degrading their navigation systems since 1940. Many refused to believe it initially, insisting their equipment had worked as designed. Only when presented with detailed records of British countermeasure operations did German aviators accept the truth. Their supposedly secure, unjammable radio navigation had been compromised from almost the moment it was deployed. Documents captured from German establishments showed that German engineers had never seriously considered the possibility of subtle beam manipulation. Dr. R.V. Jones, the young physicist whose insight and determination had initiated the British countermeasure program, received little public recognition during the war due to classification. He continued working in scientific intelligence, contributing to numerous other technical breakthroughs. His memoirs, Most Secret War, published in 1978, finally revealed the full story of the Battle of the Beams to the public and became recognized as a classic account of scientific intelligence work. The German pilots who had flown their missions trusting in Knickebein, X-Gerät and Y-Gerät never knew during the war that invisible British transmitters were bending their guidance beams. Hauptmann Werner Hoffman survived the war and learned in a British prisoner of war camp that his navigation system had been compromised. In a 1952 interview, he reflected, "We believed absolutely in our equipment. When bombs fell short or wide, we blamed weather, altitude errors, anything except the possibility that the British were manipulating the very radio beams we trusted. That was the genius of their countermeasures. They let us keep our confidence in technology while systematically defeating that technology. The Battle of the Beams established principles of electronic warfare that remain relevant today. The contest demonstrated that complex electronic systems are vulnerable not just to crude jamming, but to sophisticated spoofing that exploits the system's operational logic. It showed that effective electronic warfare requires understanding both the technology and the operational psychology of the enemy. Most importantly, it proved that electronic dominance could be as decisive as numerical or industrial superiority. Britain, desperately outnumbered and outproduced by Germany in 1940, used scientific ingenuity and technical cleverness to neutralize German advantages. Between September 1940 and May 1941, the Luftwaffe flew approximately 60,000 bomber sorties against targets in Britain, dropping 55,000 tons of high-explosive bombs. British analysts estimated that without electronic countermeasures, bombing accuracy would have been 3 to 4 times greater, potentially delivering crippling damage to British industrial capacity. British electronic warfare may have prevented 150,000 to 200,000 tons of bombs from hitting their intended targets, equivalent to saving hundreds of factories, thousands of homes, and tens of thousands of lives. A few hundred electronic warfare specialists achieved impact equivalent to preventing hundreds of successful bombing raids, representing one of the most successful force multipliers in military history. The institutional dynamics revealed important lessons about military innovation. The German approach emphasized security through secrecy, keep the systems hidden, prevent the enemy from learning they exist. The British approach emphasized security through understanding, discover enemy capabilities quickly, develop countermeasures rapidly, maintain tactical surprise while exploiting enemy systems. The British approach proved superior because it assumed the enemy was competent and resourceful. The role of intelligence integration was crucial to British success. The Battle of the Beams required coordination between signals intelligence, prisoner interrogation, photographic reconnaissance, scientific intelligence, and operational intelligence. Jones's teams synthesized all these sources into actionable understanding, demonstrating the power of integrated intelligence analysis. The technological legacy of the Battle of the Beams extended far beyond World War II. The electronic warfare techniques developed between 1940 and 1942 became the foundation for modern electronic countermeasures. The concept of manipulating enemy electronics rather than simply jamming them influenced the development of radar countermeasures, communications warfare, and eventually cyber warfare. The scientific methodology Jones pioneered for analyzing enemy technical capabilities became standard practice in technical intelligence. British investment in countermeasure technology paid unprecedented dividends. The total cost through 1941 was approximately £2 million. The value of protected industrial facilities and infrastructure was conservatively estimated at several £100 million, producing a return on investment exceeding 100 to 1. The story of the Battle of the Beams is ultimately about scientific methods applied to military problems. Jones and his colleagues succeeded not because they possessed superior technology initially, but because they approached the problem systematically. They gathered intelligence, formed hypotheses, tested theories, and adapted based on results. They treated electronic warfare as an experiment where enemy responses provided data for refining approaches. This scientific mindset was Britain's decisive advantage. Germany possessed excellent scientists and engineers, but German military culture didn't integrate scientific thinking into operational processes as thoroughly as Britain did. The lesson transcends the specific technologies of 1940. Military effectiveness in the technological age requires not just advanced equipment, but scientific methods applied to understanding and defeating enemy systems. The human cost of the Battle of the Beams, while lower than direct combat casualties, was real. Several British electronic warfare sites were bombed by German aircraft, with personnel killed. Operators worked under conditions that damaged hearing, from sustained exposure to high-power transmitters. The psychological stress of the work affected many operators long after the war. German bomber crews, misled by false navigation signals, sometimes flew into terrain or exhausted their fuel searching for targets they couldn't find, with fatal results. These casualties, though relatively few compared to the tens of thousands killed in the broader bombing campaigns, remind us that even the most technological forms of warfare exact human prices. The economic dimensions of the Battle of the Beams illustrate how intellectual capital can substitute for industrial capacity. Britain, with a smaller industrial base and fewer resources than Germany, couldn't match German production aircraft for aircraft or tank for tank. But Britain could field scientists and engineers whose creativity and innovation multiplied the effectiveness of available resources. The countermeasures that protected British industry cost a tiny fraction of what rebuilding bombed factories would have required. This economic multiplier effect of scientific innovation has only increased in subsequent decades. Modern military forces recognize that investment in research and development often yields better returns than equivalent investment in procurement, a lesson with roots in the Battle of the Beams. The story reaches its conclusion not with a dramatic final battle, but with gradual obsolescence. As German strategic priorities shifted toward the Eastern Front and as British air defences strengthened, the intensity of the night bombing campaign declined. The Luftwaffe's radio navigation systems, increasingly vulnerable to British countermeasures and operationally less reliable, were gradually abandoned in favour of simpler methods. By 1942, German night bombing of Britain had largely ceased, not because electronic warfare had made it impossible, but because Germany lacked the resources to sustain strategic bombing while fighting the Soviet Union. The Battle of the Beams faded not through decisive victory, but through strategic irrelevance as the war's focus moved elsewhere. Yet its impact was lasting. Britain had survived the period of greatest vulnerability, its industrial capacity intact, its population resilient, partly because German bombers had been systematically led astray by invisible British transmitters. The final assessment of the Battle of the Beams must acknowledge both what was achieved and what limitations existed. British electronic warfare significantly degraded German bombing accuracy, protecting critical infrastructure and saving lives. But countermeasures didn't make night bombing impossible. They made it less accurate. German bombs still fell on British cities, still killed civilians, still caused terrible destruction. Electronic warfare was one component of an integrated defence that included fighters, anti-aircraft artillery, civil defence and industrial dispersal. The contribution of countermeasures was substantial but not solely decisive. This nuanced assessment reflects the reality of modern warfare. Rarely does any single capability determine outcomes. Victory comes from effectively integrating multiple capabilities in ways that create advantages greater than the sum of individual parts. For the German pilots who had flown through British nights trusting their radio navigation, the revelation that their beams had been bent came as profound shock. They had believed in German technical superiority, had trusted their equipment absolutely, had attributed bombing failures to every cause except enemy interference. Learning after the war that British scientists had been manipulating the very signals they depended upon challenged their understanding of the conflict. Some German veterans refused to accept it, even when presented with documentary evidence. Others felt betrayed by their own technical services that had assured them the navigation systems were secure. A few expressed professional admiration for the British achievement, but all shared the realization that they had fought a war within a war, an invisible contest in the electromagnetic spectrum, where they never knew they were losing until long after the battle was over. The Battle of the Beams faded, not through decisive victory, but through strategic irrelevance as the war's focus moved elsewhere. Yet its impact was lasting. Britain had survived the period of greatest vulnerability, its industrial capacity intact, its population resilient, partly because German bombers had been systematically led astray by invisible British transmitters. The Battle of the Beams stands as testament to human ingenuity applied to the direst circumstances. When Britain stood alone in 1940, facing an enemy with superior numbers and sophisticated technology, British scientists and engineers found ways to neutralize enemy advantages through cleverness and determination. They bent radio beams, but more fundamentally, they bent the course of history. The bombs that fell in empty fields instead of on factories, the navigation systems that guided aircraft astray, the German confidence that persisted despite systematic failure. These were achievements, products of dedicated work by men and women whose names remained secret for decades, but whose contributions helped ensure that Britain survived its darkest hour and ultimately prevailed.